Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today I'm joined with Rachel Farris. How are you doing tonight, Rachel?
I'm doing great. How are you, Kirk?
Great, great. Well, glad to have you in the show. This is an exciting topic. I've been meaning to talk about this for a while. It's always of interest to me, but it's hard to find people with this kind of knowledge. So Rachel, tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I run a CPA firm that has offices in both San Francisco and Puerto Rico. We specialize in helping individuals, entrepreneurs, and businesses relocate to Puerto Rico to take advantage of the Act 60 tax incentives. So, for those of you that haven't heard of that, that is essentially a 0% tax on all short and long-term capital gains, a 0% tax on interest and dividends, and a 4% corporate income tax rate. So, for people that really want to get an edge over the competition or gain financial freedom, Puerto Rico has become a very lucrative opportunity for a lot of US citizens.
Cool, cool. So how did you get involved with this? You're an accounting firm. Do you do other things, or is this just all you do as an accounting firm?
We only do Act 60, so a kind of an interesting thought process. I was working in Big Four accounting for quite a many years in mergers and acquisitions, and I had a family friend that came to me that was looking to move to Puerto Rico, and I had never heard of Act 60's tax incentives. I was actually quite confused why they'd leave their fancy life in California to move halfway across the world to a little Caribbean island. And once I started poking into it and helping them out a little bit more, I realized what an opportunity this was. So I slowly started doing consulting part-time basis over the past few years and recently took it on just over a year ago on a full-time basis. And we've built the firm up, really leveraging AI. And it was really at the perfect time where we've been able to scale. Act 60 is the only thing we focus on, but obviously clients have other needs as well. So we know a lot of other lawyers, CPAs, etc., with different specialties that we're able to loop into that equation to really provide a full breadth of service.
Now, so give us kind of like a high level before we get into the weeds here, just so people totally understand. I'm sure they're intrigued by the 0% capital gains and income, but give us a high level of what's going on. How is this even a thing? Like what's the deal?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you all probably know, Puerto Rico has been dealing with economic problems for quite a long time. Lots of instability and debt on the island. So, around 2012, they wanted to introduce a way to bring entrepreneurship and capital and talent to the actual island. So, it started off with Acts 21 and 22, and that really was kind of the base level for Act 60, what it is today. After Hurricane Maria came through and the destruction that happened to the island of Puerto Rico, they renewed a lot of these benefits and created X60. So essentially, this is a way to help motivate and promote the Puerto Rican economy a little bit more, add a little bit of stimulation. And the reason why this is possible is because Puerto Rico is a US territory. And so, because they are a territory, they actually don't have voting rights when it comes to the US government and Congress, etc. So, they're able to create their own rules. So, we've always heard the phrase to no taxation without representation. Well, that's essentially the case. So, they can be a US territory, you can still be a US citizen living down there, but you can take advantage of these tax incentives without renouncing your citizenship. For a lot of people that want to take advantage of things like the Cayman Islands, Dubai, Singapore, other popular tax havens, a lot of times US citizens are taxed on their worldwide income. And so you need to renounce your citizenship to fully be able to legally take advantage of those same types of tax benefits. Whereas in Puerto Rico, it is fully legal to keep your US citizenship as long as you become a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, but if you announce your citizenship to the US, you also have to pay basically taxes as if you were had an estate. So it doesn't
So
really
actually
help.
no, since it's a yeah, no, since it's not a territory, since it's a territory, right? You're still a US citizen. You're not renouncing US citizenship at all. You're establishing resident kind of like you would in a different state, right? If I moved from California to Arizona to take advantage of lower taxes, right? Is the exact same thing as moving down to Puerto Rico. Think of it as moving to another state. But because states do have representation in Congress and government, they're not able to establish their own tax systems. Whereas since Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, they are able to, which is why they're able to offer really lucrative things like 0% tax on capital gains, a 4% corporate income tax, etc. So you're not needing to necessarily pay extra taxes. That being said, one really key detail here, it's on post-move appreciation. So when we're thinking about your audience who's very much into investing, right? Let's say you've owned Apple stock for 5 years before you move to Puerto Rico, and you own it for another 3 years and then you sell. Well, we'll mark down what the actual value of that stock was on the day you moved to Puerto Rico. You're going to pay US federal tax on the 5 years up until that date. All the appreciation after that is going to be taxed at 0%. There's some tricky rules with a 10-year rule where if you hold it for 10 years and you live in Puerto Rico, it's taxed at 5%. But it's one of those things where it isn't necessarily all the things that you've ever held in your whole life. You move down, you don't have to pay tax at all. It's after you move, any income that you earn, any investments that you then have and have appreciation after, those are then taxed at the preferential rates.
Okay, so if I own a company, built it from scratch, it's a $1 billion company, and I sell it for $1 billion, um, and before I do that, I move to Puerto Rico. You're saying that I can't get the benefits because all that was attributed to the U.S. It's only what happens while I'm in Puerto Rico that is tax-free.
That's correct. So I have a lot of situations with clients where, let's say they've owned a business in California for 10 years, they move to Puerto Rico, they operate it there for 5 years, and they sell it after. Well, because it's not publicly traded in a lot of cases with smaller businesses, what you'd actually do is do a valuation. So you'd see the valuation on the day that you move down, then any evaluation after that will be taxed at the preferential rates. Anything beforehand will be taxed at US rates. If you decide not to do a valuation study, another way I see it is pro rata. So, divide the number of days that you spent in the US by the total number of days that you spent in both the US and Puerto Rico owning it, and you can attribute it that way as well. So really, this is a great idea for people that expect to have growth on the horizon, that expect, their investments are going to boom, that their business is going to grow. It's not a great opportunity for someone that's like, hey, I've owned a business for 20 years in the US. I want to move and I'm going to sell within the year. You're not going to get those benefits. And I often mistakenly see people assume that they are going to get those types of benefits and move down and realize that's not the case, or they open themselves up to vulnerabilities with the IRS or the state tax boards.
Okay. So yeah, so it's great if you're starting a virtual business that's going to do really well and you're in Puerto Rico, you don't have to pay any taxes on the income, on the dividends, on the appreciation. Um, I guess maybe corporate taxes, but why would you set up a corporation if if you're going to be paying even 4%?
Yeah, so the way I see a lot of things going is sometimes it's not new businesses coming in, right? Sometimes they're developing a branch or a sister company or an operating entity down in Puerto Rico to be able to funnel some of that services revenue down to Puerto Rico. Now, the 4% tax, I mean, if you're living in California, for instance, right, you are having to pay state income tax and federal income tax. You move to Puerto Rico, you pay 4% across the whole board. So if you're in one of those top income brackets in California, you're paying 50 something percent, 52, 53%. That'll be knocked down to 4%. When you move to Puerto Rico, you don't have to pay federal tax. So you're essentially just paying their version of a state tax, which is that 4%. So even if you're in a no tax state, you're still required to pay federal taxes, correct? Here, you're basically exempt from all that, and you're knocking your tax rate down to 4%.
So you mentioned something also which I'm aware of, and it's also I have some clients that are doing this, is that if you let's say you buy I don't know, let's say you buy Bitcoin, right? You bought Bitcoin when it was trading at a penny and now it's trading at 100,000 and you're worth, bazillion dollars. And my understanding is if you move to Puerto Rico, you can actually move down there and have it be tax free when you sell it. You just have to be there for a while, right?
Yeah, so the idea behind that, again, is it depends on the value that moved down. So things like cryptocurrency that are generally still somewhat publicly traded, you'll normally mark that on the day that you move down. Any appreciation after that after that moment is going to be subject to Puerto Rican taxation. Then comes in the 10-year rule. So if you stay in Puerto Rico for 10 years, you're holding those investments, even those pre-move appreciation will be taxed at 5%. It won't be taxed at the 0% necessarily, but if you stay there for 10 years, it'll be taxed at 5%. I don't often see people staying for the full 10 years to be fully transparent. A lot of people end up staying for a less amount of time. But because things with cryptocurrency are so kind of variable on a lot of times, and there's a lot of growth opportunity, a lot of the people that I work with that are in crypto still receive amazing benefits because every single time it goes up or they strategically plan their move or strategically sell buying and selling, they're really able to capture those capital gains and get them taxed at 0%.
So why don't you see people staying for 10 years? Like, I mean, if you're going to do it. Like, why wouldn't people stay?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that going into that, right? I get a lot of younger people that are moving down that eventually want to start families and have kids and, bring their kids into US schooling or be closer to their grandparents who still live back in the States. I have people with young kids that move down that, want to spend a few years, 3 to 5 years there, but they want to put their kids in high school in the States. Or you have people that end up retiring that eventually want to move back to the States. There are people that stick down there much longer as well, but it really depends on people's situations. And I find that Puerto Rican style of life is a little bit different than the US style of life. And some people absolutely love it, and some people love it for a few years. And then after that, they decide, hey, I would rather go back to California and be near my friends and family yet again because it's a little bit hard to get out to Puerto Rico. So it fully depends on the across the board. If you're someone who loves a beautiful tropical island and you're from Miami originally, I would say it's really not that different of a style of life. But if you're from Seattle, Washington, and you're having all your family back there, you have kids that are in college and they're starting to have kids eventually, you might want to end up being a little bit closer to family if they're not willing to move down to Puerto Rico.
So how's you said it's the style of life's different. How's it different? Like
Yeah,
what's
definitely. Well, first of all, I think it's a little bit cheaper, so it's absolutely beautiful down there. You're getting pretty great weather all year round, but it does get pretty humid in the summertime. Obviously, there's a risk for hurricanes as well, but my hot tip on that, because I do spend part of my year down there, is that you can always book refundable flights whenever hurricanes come in. Normally, you have pretty good notice, and if you just book a quick flight out direct to Texas or something like that, every single day, you just either refund the flight or decide to take the flight if it becomes a little bit more of a risk. I will say activities there are a little bit different. So I'm from California originally. Down there, obviously, you still have surfing, all those different things, but you also have a beautiful rainforest down there. A lot of people like hiking, biking, exploring local culture. I will also say it's predominantly Spanish speaking. So there are very big expat communities where people do speak English, but you can also kind of integrate into local culture as well, which is much different than most of the culture that we see in the US. I think the other big thing to mention is just the power grid. I know that's often in the news. I will say I personally don't have an issue. Most nice buildings or houses actually have generators that come with them. And so even if the power does go out, you normally have a few days of electricity before you need to worry about it. I've never been without electricity when I've lived down there. That being said, obviously, if you move into a complex or a building that doesn't have that, you might obviously experience issues with the power grid. And that's something that a lot of people aren't used to in the States.
So do you think so what are the requirements? Because you're not chained to the island for 10 years or whatever it is, right? What are the requirements if you quote unquote live there? Because even in the US, you can spend 50% of your time in one state, 50% of your time in another state, and you obviously have to have like a certain amount of days, 181 days in order to be considered, that resident of that state, plus other stuff,
Mhm.
circumstance of evidence. Um but for something like Puerto Rico, is it the same thing? Is it like 181 days or like what are the actual requirements?
Yeah, so there's three different tests that you need to meet. The first one is the presence test. And so generally that looks like 183 days. That being said, there's actually different IRS rules. So you could do 549 days over 3 years, or you could not make more than $3,000 in the US. There's a lot of different rules to be able to meet that presence test, but the most common and safe option is to do the 183 days. That being said, one differentiation point I want to make is that days for residency purposes look a bit different than days for income sourcing purposes. So, if you're an investor, what that looks like is you need to initiate trades when you're in Puerto Rico. So, when you're buying or selling or whatever it is, you need to be physically located in Puerto Rico. You can go spend the rest of your time traveling around or in the States or wherever it is. But if you're trading, you want that to be done when you are physically located in Puerto Rico. For businesses, this looks a little bit different. Let's say you spend 183 days in Puerto Rico, the bare minimum, and you spend the rest of the year traveling different states in the United States. Well, export services decrees, which is a big decree coming out of Puerto Rico, means you are exporting services off the island. So you need to be physically located on the island to receive those tax incentives. So if you spend 183 days on the island, those 183 days of revenue generation will be taxed at that 4% corporate income tax rate. But if you spend the rest of the time in your US, you could be subject to US taxation on that as well. It's very similar to how state rules work as well. Let's say, I mean, New York has very interesting, rules around residency. So does California, right? You could actually be claimed to have residency in two states if you end up spending enough time there. So for California, let's say you don't spend your 183 days, but you end up having a very big presence. Your kids go to school there. You have a house there. You visit frequently. California might claim residency even though you spend over 183 days in Arizona. So you could have a dual residency case there. So it's very important that you're substantiating that. The other two tests are the tax home test, which is basically where are you operating your business from. And then the third test is the closer connection test. And this is a little bit more subjective. I like to say it's the heart test. It's where your heart really lies. So you need to make an intentional effort to move to Puerto Rico. So that doesn't mean, oh, I live in Puerto Rico and I stay in an Airbnb, or I stay in a hotel, or I go to all my doctor's appointments in the United States and my kids go to school in the US and my wife lives in the US, right? You need to have moved down to Puerto Rico and you need to make it look like you've moved down to Puerto Rico for the long run. That being said, for years, I would say generally a lot of residency statutes revolve around a 3 year timeline. So I recommend that clients stay for at least 3 years. I often recommend more. I would say that's the bare minimum. I generally see people staying right around that 5 to 7 year mark.
Okay. Well, I would think if you're going to be 7 years, what's another three if you get in the virtually tax-free kind of nature? But
Trust
uh,
me, I always say the exact same thing, but I think it just depends on who actually likes being down there and, how long people are willing to be down there for. A lot of people actually end up taking exit opportunities while they're down there, and then they realize, hey, I've just sold my business or I sold a huge portion of my investments. The tax benefits aren't really benefiting me the way that they used to. I'm going to now move back to the States or whatever it might be.
yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who live there, and I guess from what I understand it, there is a pretty good expat community, tech and crypto community there of people who see the same benefits, obviously. Um, and and they've also said the same thing, like you're living on an island. For better or worse, you're on an island, and that's part of the problem, right? It's
Mhm.
it's great, but it's limiting, right? If you don't go very far, if you live in a town in the US and you never venture outside that town, you're probably fine. But if you like to travel, if you like to move around and visit places, it's a little bit more difficult the way I understand it.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. There are unique rules. So, for residency purposes, you can spend 30 days in another foreign country, and those can count towards days as Puerto Rican days. There's a lot of small, little, minute rules that you can kind of use as loopholes to be able to substantiate that a little bit more. But yeah, I completely get it. I mean, I do live part of my year down there. I really enjoy it. That being said, I live part of my year down there. Some people absolutely love it, want to live all the year down there. They don't even want to come back to the States. So, it fully depends on your unique situation and where you're at in life. But I think it's beautiful. And I also think that those expat communities are so helpful. A lot of my clients actually end up developing business relationships or finding new investment opportunities because of the people they meet down there that have that same kind of go-getter mindset that really takes to move down to Puerto Rico and uproot your life for tax purposes.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's very interesting. What are some of the I've never been there, so it's something on my list. But what are some of the you mentioned some of them, but like what are some of the other reasons you'd move? Let's just say it wasn't financial. Like why would you go to Puerto Rico? What are like the best parts about Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I would say it's beautiful, first of all. Great food, great beaches, wonderful weather if you're coming from a colder state. Summer obviously gets a little bit humid, but AC is always a thing. I would also say that a lot of people like the cheaper cost of living. You're able to get a lot more bang for your buck. Groceries in general are cheaper. Buying a car can be cheaper. Buying a house can be cheaper. So if you want to live a style of life, if you're living in California and you're like, what can a million get me in California? A million is going to get you a lot farther in Puerto Rico than it would in California. So again, style of life, even if you don't take advantage of the tax incentives, goes up a little bit. People also like it because it actually has a very good airport hub as well. So, if you're coming from California, sometimes you're limited depending on where you are. If you're coming from one of the middle states, maybe you always have to fly, I don't know, not direct everywhere. Here, you have direct flights to New York, Texas, Florida, Europe, even South America. You have a lot of great options. And so, if you plan on traveling, you actually have a really good hub spot to access a lot of South America, Central America, and Europe as well.
So I've talked to people who live in Central America, and many of them have they've got people in the house, like somebody's doing the cooking, the cleaning, and it's like dirt cheap to do this. There's to have somebody like a live-in kind of helper and to do all the things. How much cheaper is it cost of living? Like, is it a little bit cheaper? Is it like a lot cheaper? Like, is it like what does that look like?
I will say it depends on where the island you actually live. So if you're living in the fancy gated communities in Dorado that are linked up to the Ritz-Carlton, you actually might be spending more than you would in the United States. But if you're living in, I don't know, Condado, Old San Juan, if you're living in an area that really isn't overrun with a huge gated expat community, your cost of living could be almost half of what it is, depending on what state you're actually coming from. For work and labor, again, that tends to be cheaper as well, and food tends to be cheaper. So for getting your house clean for gardeners, all of that tends to be at a lower cost than you would experience in most states.
Okay, cool. Um, So, what are some of the, I guess, pitfalls or things that people should be concerned about as they're thinking about this? I mean, this is obviously a very attractive thing, and I've talked to a lot of people about it. But what are some of the pitfalls people need to really be focused on if they're going to consider this and change their life around for the financial aspect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the big thing is misinformation first. I think there are a lot of people out there putting out content about this that aren't licensed professionals. And I always experience this when I go down to Puerto Rico and I go to the resort, and people are like, oh, yeah, I have my house back in California. My kids go to school there. Like, I just go out and fly out once a week to go see my wife, yada, yada, yada. I would be concerned about the fact that people take a lot of kind of word of mouth versus taking advice from actual professionals. You want to make sure you're doing things correct the first time around. And where that really stems from is the IRS does have a campaign looking into people that have moved down to Puerto Rico that are not following the rules. And so because there's an active campaign out there, you want to make sure you're doing things correctly the first time around and you don't want to cut corners. And so what I see from a lot of people is, they try to save on money at the very front, handle it themselves, or just listen to their friends who have moved down. I find that a lot of times that ends up digging them a little bit of a grave, and then they're struggling to get out of it when the IRS contacts them or when they realize they haven't done something correctly. So those are kind of the major pitfalls that I would see. You want to make sure that you do things correctly because the IRS and state tax boards have almost unlimited funds to go after you. And so you might as well not risk the money that you are saving in Puerto Rico just because you want to save some money on legal fees or CPA fees. I would say the other big pitfall is you can't necessarily skirt around the rules. A lot of people like to say, oh, you can just VPN down to Puerto Rico, or, I'm just not going to take my phone with me and I'm going to pay in cash when I leave. Unfortunately, that's not enough. They have ways to look into things during a residency audit. You should not be cutting corners and cutting it that close. You really need to actually be living down there. And if you're not willing to make the commitment to actually live down in Puerto Rico, these aren't benefits that I would recommend considering.
Yeah, I think there's one thing people like to do. They like to skirt the rules, and I've as I tell everybody who says something like that, I say it's just not worth it. Like
Hmm.
it's like if you could steal $1 billion, would you? Like I'm sure there's an amount of money that people would steal and be like, yeah, I guess that's enough. But if you did that, like people would be after you. So there's nothing that's worth it because you're going to be stressed out about getting audited by the IRS and all the stuff that
Hmm.
comes along with it. Um, so yeah, I totally get what you're saying with that. But what are some other things? Because I know that I'm not as familiar with the hurricane season and whatnot, but obviously a few of the islands over there get hit relatively frequently. Haiti's kind of a mess, Dominican Republic and Cuba and Jamaica, all these places get hit in hurricane season. What's is it that bad, or is it just kind of how does that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I will say hurricanes are always a risk. I'm not going to say they're not. Puerto Rico has been hit by large hurricanes in the past, and they definitely will in the future again. I think the best way to work around this is what I tend to do, and what a lot of people, expats that have moved down, tend to do, is when you hear a warning that there's going to be a hurricane coming, I like to book a flight every single day that week that's refundable. So Monday through Friday, I will book a flight every single day. If I don't feel like I need to leave the island that day, I'll cancel my flight. If I do feel like I need to leave the island that day, I'll take that flight and then cancel my flights the rest of the week. There are some really good airports down there, and it is very easy to get off the island. And normally with hurricanes, you actually have a good amount of warning ahead of time. So it's just being able to be prepared and making sure you can take action when you want to. Another solution that I do see from people, especially more of the investing side, where they have a little bit more flexibility with the number of days they need to be on the island, they actually just spend hurricane season traveling or back in the US. They just don't stick around there for that long. And I also fully support that option. It depends on your individual needs and your propensity for risk. But that is also fully an option as well. And I see a lot of people taking advantage of that.
Yeah, I mean, one question is do you even need to leave? Do they get that bad where you really actually need to leave? That certainly crossed my mind.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
Hurricane Maria, I will say people obviously did need to leave. That was a huge hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. In recent years, I mean, I've never had to leave the island. A lot of people I know down there have never had to leave the island. It also depends on where in the island you are. Are you right by the beach? Are you further up? Are you on a hill? Are you in a large building that's a new construction? How do you feel about it? Are you on like a little shack by the beach, right? There's a lot of different concerns and it kind of depends person per person. But for the most part, I really have not heard of many people in recent years needing to actually leave the island. And when you're looking for a property or things like that, that's a lot of stuff you want to consider. Is maybe you can find a property that's built with concrete a little bit more inland, higher elevation, whatever it might be, and then you won't have to worry as much about when the hurricane hits.
yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at is the topography. I don't know the topography, but it's interesting. Um, so let me ask you this because when you're choosing to live a place, financials are part of it for sure. But there's a lot of other things like medical services, education for the kids, like all this stuff. Like, what is it like on the island for those things? Like, what if I had to get a medical procedure? Do I just walk in a local clinic or do I have to shuttle myself to off island to somewhere else?
Yeah, so for big medical procedures, I generally recommend that you go off island. Actually, days for medical purposes actually count as days for Puerto Rico residency. So if you need to leave because you want to get a surgery and you don't trust Puerto Rican doctors to do it, or you want to go to a specialist in New York, you can actually count the days that you are there specifically for medical purposes towards days for your actual Puerto Rican residency. That being said, if you decide to go get a surgery and then you chalk on a few extra days for tourism, those days for tourism aren't going to count. For day-to-day doctor's appointments, I do think it's important to have a primary care physician in Puerto Rico. The quality of care is actually pretty good. There are some very advanced hospitals down there, and there are actually subscription programs as well to get access to higher level care if you are willing to pay for it. There are a lot of the communities actually have their own urgent care centers as well that they're developing. I know Moncayo, which is a new community that I believe is supposed to be finished in 2027, they'll have their own whole hospital network in there, and they'll have a helicopter to be able to bring people to hospitals or off the island very quickly if you need it. For things like dental care, I mean, you can go to a dentist there as well. I think that care is very similar. The licensing requirements are quite similar to those of the US. For schools, there actually is a pretty good private school system. So a lot of the private schools down there have partnerships with some Florida school districts for private schools. And so they're able to have that very same curriculum. And also if you're moving back to Florida after it, as for kind of ease of transition, they have some top-notch teachers down there. People also take the homeschooling route as well if they don't want to send their kids to private school or aren't able to afford it. Most of the public schools are taught in Spanish, so I will say that tends not to be a great option for people that are coming down as expats. But it completely depends. For everything else, I mean, buying a car, insurance, all of that, there are kind of different systems to work through, but there are Puerto Rican concierge services that are able to help you navigate that. So when you do move down and you need to go get a new driver's license, right? You might not speak Spanish, but there are people that you can hire for pretty cheap that'll help you go into the DMV, get the right paperwork, and file it all out for you.
Nice. Nice. Well, it's great to hear that they're catering towards the non to be Puerto Rican residents, I guess you could say.
Mhm.
Um, cool. So well, this has been great. Any other things we should know about, Act 60 or moving to Puerto Rico or any other maybe ways this can be integrated into somebody's life?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say this is one of the most unique opportunities that people have to either create financial freedom for themselves, retire early, or get that competitive edge and build a business. I am seeing flocks of people moving down. There's already been over 7,000 decrees approved, and I believe there's almost 15,000 in process right now. So a lot of people are just kind of giving the political instability and market volatility over the past year are really looking to Puerto Rico to be able to make sure that they're able to afford the lifestyle they want or even get a competitive edge over a business partner. I mean, I get a lot of startups that come in my door saying, hey, I want to funnel all those tax savings back into my business, and then they're able to sell in the next few years versus their competitors who are having to pay taxes out in California or New York are not being able to really take advantage of that competitive edge. Other than that, I mean, I think it takes a special type of person to move down. And if people have questions, I would definitely recommend reaching out to me. I know that sometimes it can look a little daunting wanting to hire a CPA or a lawyer to be able to walk you through this process to talk about eligibility. But I've actually built this education course at maximizewealth.com that walks you through the basics of eligibility, filling out the forms, tips and tricks to save more money, everything that the average Joe would essentially need to move down to Puerto Rico and figure out how compliance actually works. So I would recommend checking that out. Or if you really like a more of a hand experience, you're welcome to visit my website specifically, rachelfarriscpa.com, and I offer free consultations to people looking to move down. My white glove services are definitely more for the high net worth crowd, but I will handle that entire process for you, loop you in with all the lawyers necessary, and get you on the right track. I think it's just important to make sure that you're doing things right the first time around and that you're getting information from the right people.
Well, Rachel, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us. I think I'm glad we had a chance to chat about this because I love this topic, and I think probably the vast majority of people don't even know it's an option. So thank you for joining the show, and yeah, we'll have you back on in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kirk. I appreciate it.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. I mean, like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right. Well, that was a great interview with Rachel. Really appreciate her coming on the show. Now, into the panel portion of the show, where we have our very own Barb Freeberg. Hey, Barb.
Hey, happy to be here.
Glad to have you as well. And we also have our very own Doug Hagren. Hey, Doug.
Hey Kirk, good to see you again. It's like I never get time away from you, Kirk. It's like my family and you. I'm just gonna adopt you because we just spend so much time together as it is.
You can definitely adopt me, Doug, because I need more parents.
That's right.
I need more people telling me what to do.
Well, and Barb and I were as Barb and I were talking before we started this. with a 16-year-old, a 12-year-old, I am as polished of a parent as they come. This is, I'm happy to just add one more in and, one more thing to yell about. So
Yeah.
go
Well,
for
there's
it.
nothing like getting another dependent on your tax returns. So I
So
know
there
that's
we
what you were
are.
thinking.
What a segue.
What a
Way to go,
segue.
Kirk. Yes, let's talk taxes.
All right. So, Barb, what were some of your takeaways from the interview?
I like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is lovely.
Mhm.
But my main takeaway is, would I want to move there for tax purposes? There's a lot of loopholes and there's a lot of things you want to check out. I really liked how Rachel talked about the things you want to watch out for. And with every advantage, there comes a disadvantage. And so I look forward to talking about possible ways to lower our taxes, but also the flip side of what it's going to cost you.
Yeah, I agree. Doug, what about you? What are some of your thoughts?
You know, I think one of the things that makes this very relevant in today's economy is that taxes are one of the few levers that, individuals and particularly entrepreneurs still control. Inflation, rates, volatility, they're all out of your hands. But tax planning, that is proactive risk management. And the fact remains, there's only, about 100 rules in the books that tell you how to pay taxes. There's tens of thousands of ways to avoid them. Unfortunately, most people don't know how to do it. They don't have access to it. Most W-2 employees are going to struggle with that, but this is one of those areas that does give a lot of opportunity. Um, for an entrepreneur, it's about reinvestment capacity. A startup reinvesting 96 cents on the dollar in Puerto Rico is in a different league than one reinvesting 60 cents in, Barb's neck of the woods in California. And I live in Minnesota where we talk about snowbirds all the time, individuals who have moved down to the warmer climates, particularly places like Florida and Texas, and places like Puerto Rico are emerging as an offshore extension of that same trend. Low tax, lifestyle driven modes, and ultimately a tax alignment with a growth trajectory because every dollar you don't send to the IRS is a dollar that you can reinvest in your vision.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So, Barb, what are some of your thoughts here? Because, everyone's looking to save on taxes, and especially people from California who are getting hit particularly hard. You know, I've seen a lot of tax strategies. What do you think of this one? Is this worth it? I mean, I've never been to Puerto Rico, so I don't know. I have clients who moved there for this, and they're definitely following the rules and doing all the things necessary to do it. But I don't know. It's kind of it's a big commitment for this kind of a tax strategy.
It's such a personal decision because what you want to do to save money on taxes is really a question of how far are you willing to go. The rules are pretty specific, so you're going to have to commit to living in Puerto Rico for quite a while in order to take advantage of those benefits. And if you're just starting out and you're an entrepreneur and your business looks like it's got some real growth potential, then I'd say, yeah, that might be worth taking a look at. Because if you're saving that percentage of taxes, that's more money that you can reinvest in your business. Other than that, it's so personal. My parents were Ohioans, but they also had a condo in Florida. They adjusted their lifestyle to be residents of Florida because there was no state income tax. They followed the rules, et cetera, et cetera. For them, I assume it was worth it. But on the other hand, there were a lot of downsides. You've got to fill out two different, whole tax returns. You have to make sure you're in there the right amount of days. You also have to pick up and move twice a year. Now, a lot of people do that. You guys know that living in cold climates, a lot of people have, a second home in a warm climate. For me, that is just, it's too much work. I wouldn't want to do it.
Yeah, I'm with you, Barb. It's definitely a lot of work, and I guess if you have the money, it's fine. But it's a lot of work. What about you, Doug? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been to Puerto Rico a couple times. It is beautiful. Christopher Columbus liked it so much he decided to stay there. No, so it is one of those, it's one of the great biggest, big tourist traps when you get down there is Christopher Columbus's tomb is there. Now, of course, now I've just offended half of your listeners because they know he's a very polarizing individual. Um, but here's the thing you have to think about when one of the surprises that you have to look at in order to get the full tax benefits, you have to be there around 10 years. And again, people often stay 3 to 7 years, monetize big growth or exit, then return to the US. Not most of the people that are taking advantage of this opportunity are not going down there for the full 10 years needed for the deepest benefits. You have to understand a big cultural shift. Cost of living, wonderful. Can be 30 to 50% lower than mainland US. Outside, those luxury expat enclaves. But the culture is Spanish forward, which is, different for a lot of people. I mean, it's certainly going to be more of a shock for someone from Minnesota or Ohio going down there, for the most part. The power grid is highly unreliable. And as we are already looking now, if anybody's looked at the weather report, there is two hurricanes that are now converging again on the East Coast. So you've got to deal with, you got to deal with those weather related issues. So it's not just financial. It's a cultural, it's social, it's family driven. Many will relocate temporarily, not permanently. The IRS is going to scrutinize things like this. Don't cut corners. Warning is key. Residency audits can undo everything. There's a lot of misconceptions, with the tax side of everything. It's not going to undo past tax. It's only forward looking. But then you got to make sure, can we handle the hurricanes, grid instability, limited healthcare options for major procedures that can often require a tremendous level of contingency planning. There is some healthcare opportunities and education opportunities. I mean, routine care is going to be fine down there, but big procedures, they're going to mean flying back to the mainland. And private schools partner with Florida systems, but again, those public schools are going to be Spanish first. That's the main economy. So you have to really, we've just like you got to make sure you're doing things right. I mean, I live in Minnesota. They've won several cases of individuals, what we call snowbirds, very popular up here, who have tried to, relocated, like Barb was talking about. It's, living in Florida. But there's been several cases where people have tried to pull that off. Minnesota's gone after them and won because they considered it pseudo relocation. There's a high profile and often cited case, Marks versus the Commissioner of Revenue in Minnesota, where the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled in a 4-3 decision that all days spent in Minnesota during the tax year, including those before reestablishing domicile, could be aggregated towards what they have is called the 183-day threshold. And the court reversed a lower decision and sided with the Commissioner of Revenue as a win by the state in the tax residency contest involving snowbird scenarios. So it is something that they have, the states have gone after heavily. The IRS is obviously going after this heavily too. So, yeah, on the surface, it sounds like an amazing, wonderful way of reducing your taxes. But make sure that you really do your research because it is a significant cultural shift that most people don't want to make permanent. And one little misunderstanding could result in a significant problem with the IRS or your home state or both, because California, Minnesota being places that will certainly aggressively go after that. And unfortunately, this is one of those areas where what you don't know can hurt you.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, you see a lot of these tax strategies if you're snowbirds and, you know, what I find fascinating is the government has a lot of rules you have to follow, and each state has their own rules, and you got the federal rules. I mean, if you live outside the country for a certain number of days, you don't have to pay taxes. And I forget the specific rules on that, but I know that if you're living in Europe and you're earning income in Europe, there are some ways that you can not pay taxes in the US. I don't remember the specifics because it doesn't come across my desk that much. But there are a lot of little rules, and it pays to really do your research. It pays to go through the fine print. It pays to research what the courts are doing. Just because they say, well, 183 days, but your state doesn't like that, well, it's not going to do you much good if you don't know that. Right. And in the state, I mean, look at California. I mean, Barb lives in California. Try to leave California. It's it's like The Godfather. I try to get out, they bring me back in. It's, it's I mean, a lot of states like New York and California, where tons of people are leaving for lower tax states. California I know they just don't let go. I mean, I got a tax bill for California 15 years ago. We first started this company. We got a tax bill from California. Like, I've never been there. I haven't done any business there. Why do I have a tax bill? They were just sending tax bills to everybody because people would just pay them. And it was a great source of revenue for them. And I told them to pound sand. But a lot of these states get desperate. They're going to get more desperate. So I think one thing to think about with all this is that we are people talk about, well, tax rates are going to go up. They're not going to go down. Well, they've gone down for, slightly, but they've stayed the same or gone down for like the last 15 years. So I don't like that mental model of thinking, well, tax rates are only going to go up. They don't go up, but everyone else gets more handsy, right? The states get a little grabby at funds that they don't deserve. And then it goes to tax court, of course. They're stalked by their own people, try to fight the IRS, and they'll win in tax court, and you have to appeal it because, of course, they're going to say, yeah, you're right. I have a friend who actually won a case, self-directed IRA case, that they went to tax court. Okay, I'm going to tell you a brief thing because I think it was funny. So their accountant did something completely above board. It was a Roth IRA, and they were doing something called a DISC. I don't completely understand it, but it's basically having to do with international commissions for shipping or something. I don't know. It's called a DISC. Basically, the accountant said, all right, you can put that inside a Roth IRA. My friend had one, made a lot of money on it because it was something that they understood, and those are the best investments, the things you understand. Made a lot of money on it. And of course, my friend's dad liked to fight with the IRS. He's just one of those people. Right? On a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being, I don't like letters, I'm just going to pay it. 5 being, F you IRS. He was like a 10. So he just didn't like the IRS and didn't mind fighting with them. And of course, they would come after him because why not? If you're going to fight with us, we're going to fight with you. So he went after his kid, of course. They won in tax court. And you know what their case was? We don't believe this should be allowed. That was the IRS's case. It wasn't, you can't do this. It was, we don't believe this should be allowed. Now, to me, that sounds like you should talk to your congressman, but that's not what happened. So they won in tax court, of course. So they appealed it, and the appellate court, they beat up the IRS so bad. I mean, you have to read this. It was just hilariously funny. Or they beat up the IRS and said, how dare you waste our time? If you believe it shouldn't be allowed, you should talk to Congress. That's not a viable defense. I mean, just totally ripped them apart. And it was a viable strategy. But my point is in order to prove that, you had to go through all this shenanigans. You had to go through all these courts, appeals, and they went through the final appeal. And fortunately, the appeals court was, rational. But if you put yourself through the extreme measures of trying to save on taxes, sometimes it's not worth it. Even if you're right, even if what you're doing is correct, it may not be the best thing for you, right? Like a lot of people talk about conservation easements. They're like, oh, conservation easements, yeah, they're good. They're also on the IRS's dirty dozen list. They don't like them. They don't want you to do them. Now, you can do them with your own property, but they don't want you to buy into another one, is really where the line is. Now, can you do it? Now, I've talked to a guy who does these, and all the stuff they do is legitimate. And I asked him, I said, what do you think? He's like, He's like, I can guarantee you 100% this is going to get audited. He's like, well, when? But is 100% going to get audited? So, the question is, where are you on a scale of 1 to 5? One being, I'm scared of everything, and 5 being, I don't care. I'm just going to do whatever. A 5 is a tough person to work with because they're going to get audited. They're going to, have attorneys and accountants on staff all the time. Do you really want to live that way? That's the question. I think the point I'm trying to make is the question you have to ask is the juice worth the squeeze, right? How much are you actually saving? Is it worth the aggravation and the anxiety of fighting with the IRS and, maybe them playing dirty pool? I don't know. It's just an open question. Personally, it's not worth it. The fight, uh, it'd have to be a lot of money for me to have that worth the fight. And then, of course, you got to pay a lot of people to deal with it. So it's always the question. Now, if you own crypto at a penny and you have like a million, coins, okay, maybe it's worth fighting. But uh, there is a limit. So if you got $10,000 and you're trying to save taxes on it, probably not worth it. If you got 10 billion, maybe it's worth it. So it's just a question you have to ask yourself is how much you actually saving and how much time and aggravation are you willing to spend? So now I want to ask Barb, because I know you've seen a lot. What other kind of tax strategies like this? And this is kind of, I would put this on the extreme end. It's not a 5, it's maybe a 4 on that scale. But what other kind of things have you seen and people doing, and what's kind of your judgment on, is it worth it? But I mean, Puerto Rico is kind of a carve out case, but have you seen anything else like this?
Yes. And we can go from the extreme, a 5 or a 10 of relocating from your home to another country, or Puerto Rico's the US, but it's a territory. That's the extreme, to a more smaller choice of, okay, I live in California. My taxes are among the highest in the country. I was talking with my accountant about lowering my taxes. And one of the things he said was, well, why don't you move? Move to Nevada, move to Texas. And so that, I think, is a more reasonable, that's something that, okay, you're moving within the US, that's doable. But for me, my daughter lives 45 minutes to an hour away. No amount of tax savings makes it worth it to me to move that far for my daughter. Now, look, if my daughter moved to Nevada, yeah, sure, I'd go to Nevada. But at the present time, she doesn't have any designs on moving. So, like Kirk said, you have to look at these choices on a continuum, and one end is time and aggravation, the other end is saving money. And in the end, where do you fall? Because as I get to the last quarter of my life, I fall on, I'm going to save time at any juncture, because there's only so much money I need or expect to spend in my life. But my time is so valuable now. And those are the type of values decisions you have to make. But if you're looking for a win and you have a flexible schedule, look at saving money on your state taxes, because if you're in an expensive state, New York, Jersey, California, and you can easily move to a lower tax state, well, over your lifetime, that can save you a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's definitely interesting. I'll say a side note on that, and then I'll ask Doug. When I was younger, my dad was conservative, living in a liberal state, and I was just asked, like, why do you live here? Like, you don't like the politics, and he's into politics, and he's a registered Democrat too, which made it more interesting. He was a complicated guy, and I was like, why do you live here? Like, nothing in this state aligns with your values. Like, why do you live here? He never gave me a good answer, but as I've gotten older, I've thought a lot about it and I've figured it out. And the answer is there's a lot of good stuff here. Like politics aside, I mean, we live in an era where politics are crazy, but politics aside, like we were in Taxachusetts. They used to call us Taxachusetts back in the day. Even though those taxes are the same as they were back then, they're now actually low considered, other states. But there's a lot of good stuff that are trade-offs. Great schools, great hospitals, good people. So I think people need to really think outside the box and like how interesting like how complicated are the things that you want. It takes me a half hour to get to New Hampshire. Do I want to live there? I don't know. Maybe. I like Massachusetts. It's expensive though. So maybe New Hampshire would be better. So I think the questions are always more complicated than you think, and you really need to spend your time thinking about that complexity. Like, are other things more worth it? What are your thoughts, Doug? Are there other strategies people should be considering?
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing like I like that you brought up New Hampshire. New Hampshire was number 1 in the country for real estate appreciation, and that happened for a reason because they are no state tax, but they're no state tax in an area of the highest population concentration in America. So, when you talk about relocating away from family, it is much more difficult for Barb to relocate from California. As we get out west, states are huge, right? Territories are bigger. For her to go to a different state might mean going the difference between a quick drive to see family and an all-day planning around flights, right? Obviously in New England, it's much easier to move to New Hampshire. And I mean, I've been in New Hampshire. I can see the lights of Boston from New Hampshire, right? It's basically a suburb. Every state there is a suburb of every other state in that concentrated Northeast. So that's a much easier way for someone in that area. I mean, look at the number of people who live in New York City that, will live over in Connecticut, right? Or places like that. You've got a handful of states that are favorable in this, like Tennessee, New Hampshire, Florida, Texas, Nevada, that are that are offering these state these deductions. And if you can eliminate that, I mean, for example, just imagine for a second, again, the California or Minnesota, and you talked about this too, with taxes haven't been going up. That's true, right? But guess what? There's a new fee for a new, you got to go get a permit for this, or they're now building all the new highways that are all coming. They're all toll roads now, right? If you don't think taxes are going up, they are. They're just now starting to hit that gray area as to whether or not the Boston Tea Party's mandate was actually still being met. Because, is it taxation through representation? Kind of. But adding a permit is being added by the executive branch. It's not necessarily being added by the legislative branch. So now we're starting to skirt whether or not, if really people wanted to push this, is it something that is considered to be, constitutional. But again, now you got to go through all the rigmarole of going through all the legal hassles to try to fight that and win. You actually, I liked what you talked about your friend, and winning the tax case. Unfortunately, there is a ton of stories where that hasn't been the case, and there's a really, again, take or leave it depending on where you're on the divide. I listen to everything. Frontline was a series on PBS that used to do a lot of really, really good stories. And there's one from about 15 years ago, give or take, called Tax Me If You Can. I've talked about this one before. And at the time, this was coming out of the 90s, where there just was an explosion of tax loopholes that people were taking advantage of. Certain banks were advising, certain of the big six, big three, were advising companies to do things like, buying trains and leasing them back and foreign, all of these different creative strategies. And there were horror stories around it, because what would happen is they'd be recommended, and the IRS would then come in later, and the person had waived all of these taxes. The IRS would come back, and like you said, in this, we just feel like it's different, like it's wrong. And the downside of that is, it is, the officially the IRS is meant to collect what's legally owed and fairly and efficiently. And in practice, it's really under-resourced, overburdened, chasing a widening tax gap, So that is an issue that they are facing. But the IRS has heavy reliance on process and presumptions. They lean on statutory presumptions like certain deductions, tests, carry forward. Many disputes, the IRS doesn't need to prove fraud or malintent. It just often needs to show a lack of support, inconsistency, missing pieces. Audit agents carry checklists and internal rules that limit how creative taxpayers can argue unless they bring strong expert support. So you are burdened with proving your innocence, which goes against most laws. Um, if they feel that it would, if they go back and in Tax Man Can, they talked about this case where, one of this big six firms at the time said, do this and do that. And ultimately, the IRS basically said, you're right. It wasn't illegal on the books, but we have now deemed that it should have been known that it was legal. Yeah, you clearly is a shelter. And at that point, the business owner was stuck and they lost. And they had to come up and pay all of these taxes and fines. Of course, then they turned to the audit company that recommended it to them, the big six firm, and they washed their hands and said, "Hey, not our responsibility. We just gave you the suggestion, but it's your money." And so I think to answer your question, there's other things out there like captive insurance. And we've talked about how obviously, Warren Buffett has used the insurance agency loopholes to really, support the way Berkshire Hathaway has been able to reduce its tax burden. But the IRS has come down in recent years on captive insurance agencies, and being that, people are taking to be their own insurance company. They put money in these reserves, but are they really doing what they need to do under the rules of insurance mandate? Or are they just throwing it there and saying, no more tax? There's a lot of there's ways in which you can use life insurance to actually be a tax deduction. Normally, it's not life insurance, but there's plans in which if you're a C Corp, you can put money into life insurance and take a tax deduction on the entire amount, get that money out free. Now, there's ways to do this to minimize, to not get into the grips of the IRS, and the IRS has absolutely okayed this. But one of the big catches in these kind of tax scenarios comes down to Social Security. Okay. Because one of the things, as you know, when you take most tax deductions, your federal tax at the end of the day if you look at your W-2, for example, there's a different line item for federal taxable income versus Social Security FICA taxable income. Social Security FICA taxable income is a bigger line item on your W-2 than your federal taxes. So one of the big things to avoid in a lot of these tax shelters is you better still go out and pay your Medicaid, your FICA, your Social Security. And that's one of the things, even on that insurance strategy that I'm talking about, not getting into specifics, is that you better carve out, and when you claw it back, you're going to pay on the Social Security and FICA on that. This is a huge one for the IRS and bigger than anything else. You can wipe all your other taxes away, but FICA and Social Security is a getcha. In a state like Minnesota, one of the ways that they've said, well, here's the line item here, here's the line item here, here's the line item here. Oh, by the way, we have another thing called use tax. What's use tax? Well, we didn't have a specific tax for that, but if it was used and we should have taxed you on it, it falls into that use tax, and therefore we have a tax for you. So you've got to be very, very, very careful and understanding in these strategies and how you use them about where there's been some sort of past precedent. Because if you don't understand the precedent and you become the first person to set that precedent, the IRS and the other revenue agencies have a lot of leeway, and unfortunately the burden falls on you to prove that what you were doing was not just a tax sheltering. And the IRS, and again, I'll leave it with this. It really does come down to just an interpretation, because as you mentioned, the legislation should go and change that. The legislatures have always left most laws ambiguous. Okay, the way it works, and there's a lot of controversy to this. People say, well, the Supreme Court just ruled this law or just allowed that. No, that's not how it works. Legislation makes the law, executive branch enforces it, and then the Supreme Court just interprets whether or not the enforcement of that matched the Constitution. People get this confused all the time between the three areas. The legislation is almost purposefully ambiguous, and that allows the legislative or the executive branch, like the IRS, a massive berth for being able to interpret. And that puts the burden on you when they do come back and interpret these types of things. So you don't necessarily want to be the first in line when they come back and rule this. I'll leave this last thing on insurance. Back in the 1980s, life insurance, think of it this way: 18% life insurance was paying. And guess what? Life insurance was completely tax free. Now, let me ask you this. If you're a millionaire and get 18% for life tax free, you'd probably write any check for that, right? And that's exactly what they did. They came out with a single premium life insurance company, $25,000 death benefit. Peanuts, no cost whatsoever. It's like $10 a year. And said, do this and write any amount of money you want. And millionaires were like 18% tax free, wrote the check. They wrote, $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, gave it to the insurance company, slammed it shut, got tax-free 18% forever. They didn't do any, Congress didn't change the law. The IRS came back and created the MEC rules. Modified endowment contract said, sorry, can't do that. That's tax evasion. You've got to have an insurance case behind this. So what did they do? They arbitrarily came out with methodologies and mathematics to say, based on how much you're insured, this is how much money you're allowed to put into it and keep your tax benefits. That was not the legislator. That was a legislative branch. That was the IRS. And ultimately, if you put more than that, we're going to turn it into a retirement plan. We're going to tax you. We're going to penalize you. So I think to answer your question, Kirk, there are other things you can do. But remember, if you're the guinea pig, the IRS can come back and determine later in a lot of ways to make your life very, very uncomfortable. So be careful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Doug. And I'll just kind of say this before we kind of wrap it up here is I see this stuff all the time. I see a lot of crazy and cool things, and some are good, some are bad, some are questionable. But the framework I've kind of taken away from a lot of this, like there's another one, it goes by many names. Some people call it the deferred sales trust. There's many different names. I've seen so many people pitching this. Actually, years ago, we had a guy in the show who was pitching it because I'd never heard of it before. So I was like, yeah, we'll talk about it. And I was like, this is really cool. And what's interesting is many times things are being pitched are by people who don't understand it, right? They just read something and say, oh, this is what it means. So I'll give you an example. So one of these things is, oh, you sell an asset and then you defer it indefinitely. Well, there's a time frame. You can create a time frame. It could be a year, it could be 50 years, but you basically defer the taxes for a long, long period of time, and you just grows tax deferred. Really cool, right? Well, you can do that. What happened was people came in, so you can also borrow against it and you can take your money today. So you can keep it there and you can borrow it. So it's kind of this tax-free withdrawal. It's great. And they pitch it because this one company, I think it was International Paper, did it. Well, the problem is you can do that if you're one of three exceptions. And International Paper was one of those three exceptions. But they pitch it as if it applies to everybody. So they never actually read the rules. They're going around selling something because somebody told them this is the way it is. They're talking about, well, you can International Paper, and they give you all these case studies. Yeah, those fall under the exceptions. They can do it. And then what happens is the guy who created this concept is going around selling it, and he's like, well, I got a private letter ruling. Well, private letter rulings are public. They're not private. You can go search them if you know where to look. And he's like, well, I can't share it with you because it's, I asked him, I said, can I get it? He's like, well, it's private because it's a competitive advantage. I don't want my competitors to have this. And I was like, so you want me to trust you? Anyway, I looked up the private letter ruling, found it, and it had nothing to do with this. It had to do with something unrelated. And I was like, what? So when you're doing this kind of research, when you come up with this cool concept, on the surface it seems awesome. And I'm not saying Puerto Rico is great or terrible. I'm just saying like it's just a concept, right? You look at these things, you have to look beneath the surface. You can't just say, cool, no taxes, let's do it. You have to dig in deep and figure out what are the pros and cons? How does it work? Does it even work? Because I've seen a lot of these things. Doug, you mentioned, the CPAs and then washing their hands of it. I can't tell you how many times somebody's brought this to my attention. It's a CPA or an attorney who's brought this or somebody else. And either them or you go somewhere else and you talk like this one I mentioned, the deferred sales trust. I brought it to an attorney, the estate planning attorney. I was like, would this fly? And she's like, yeah, it would fly. I was like, would you do it? She's like, yeah, I'd help you do it. I said, would you put your liability behind it? She's like, nope. I was like, that's my answer, right? Because you're not getting an answer because attorneys and accountants aren't necessarily liable for telling you to do this. So if they say, yeah, you should be able to do that, you want to ask them, okay, would you put your liability behind it and stand behind it? Now, if it's like a installment sale, which has been around since like the 60s, I think, that has a lot of cases that have gone through. It's perfectly fine, right? Installment sale, you do it over time, perfectly fine. Yeah, I'm not even an accountant, I'd put my liability behind it because it's tried and true. Everyone knows it works, right? If it's just plain vanilla. But when you do these weird carve outs and you have an attorney or an accountant come in and say, oh, yeah, you should be able to do this, that, and the other thing, you need to find out, are they willing to put their own liability behind it? Because if you're skirting the rules and they figured this cool thing out, which by the way, I'll have a guy on in the future. There's a cool thing I found this morning. Well, I have to figure it out. Like, it sounds cool. It's not all roses, but there's some cool aspects of it. It helps with the planning. It's cool to find these things. And I feel like a kid in Christmas finding these things because it's so cool. I'm like the person who discovered it. But at the end of the day, you have to figure out like what is going to happen when the shit hits the fan. Because that's the reality. At some point it will, and you have to say, all right, well, how is this going to play out? Is this something on a 1 to 5 scale? Is it a 5? Is it a 1? Is it a 3? Like, where does it fall? And is this within my comfort level? That's what you have to figure out. And the deferred sales trust, as an example, that was one that people wouldn't stand behind. I couldn't find an attorney or an accountant who would stand behind it. And the founder of this, and I think it's not the deferred sales trust, it's a different one, but the guy who came up with this concept, he's fighting with the IRS and tax court. Like, it's an ongoing battle. It's been for years, I think. This guy's fighting with him because they want his client list, because they want a bunch of people they can go after. They're trying to sue him for the client list. And so, anyway, my point is you have to really do your research because what people say publicly and what's going on privately aren't necessarily the same thing. So, Barb, we're going to wrap it up here. Final thoughts from you.
The examples you gave, both of you, are really just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many examples of how tax strategies that one thinks at the time are going to save you a lot of money in the long run have long-term consequences, sometimes that you can predict, and other times, because the law changes or the interpretation changes, you cannot predict. So when you see something that looks too good to be true, you better dig in and do a little bit of extra research. I'm Barbara Friedberg, and you can find me on my YouTube channel and at Barbara Friedberg Personal Finance.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Barb. Doug, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I wanted to really quickly touch on this before we go. You were talking about living outside the United States, and that's the foreign earned income exclusion. But again, you got to know what you're getting into. You got to remember, U.S. citizens are taxed on worldwide income no matter where they live, but you can exclude up to $126,500 as of 2024 of earned income, not investments, if you meet one of the two tests. First of all, and this is where the loopholes come in, or I'm sorry, the nuances. Physical presence test. You must be physically present in a foreign country or countries at least 330 full days out of a 12-month period. And what they mean by full days is 24 hours. So a short trip back to the U.S. can count against you. Now, this isn't going to work, it'd be an issue with Puerto Rico because it's a U.S. jurisdiction. So, but the other, but the other point thing is you must be a bona fide resident of the foreign country for an entire tax year with evidence of an intent to stay. That means resident permit, local ties. It only applies to earned income, wages, salary, self-employment, not passive income like dividends, capital gains, and retirement distributions. The other option, you can always renounce your citizenship and you'll remain liable for the U.S. tax on worldwide incomes, even if you do that, even if you live a lot. I'm sorry, and unless if you do renounce, you will no longer be. But then again, you will no longer be a U.S. citizen. So you got to ask yourself, what's it worth? And what do you want to give up? By the way, you were talking about giving, they want the list. UBS, I don't know if anybody's heard this. UBS is talking about moving to the United States. This is the ultimate Swiss bank. Privacy, they've been under pressure for a number of years anyway, but imagine what those lists are going to look like if UBS now becomes a U.S. banking entity. So I'm just going to finish with this. You just can't wing tax strategy in 2025. You've got to know regulations. You've got to document every move. You've got to stay ahead of reinterpretation, because no matter how clean the idea was when it was proposed, it's just one big, beautiful bill shift away from becoming the target of a new audit regime. And it's not just academic. Recent tax law changes are coming fast. There's been legislation, there's been regulations, enforcement priorities. The authorities love to pass big consolidation bills, like One Big Beautiful Bill, that collapses these loopholes, rewrites these interpretations, or elevates auditing powers overnight. So if your structure relies on yesterday's rules without documentation, you're working towards a trap. And that goes for everything. Puerto Rico, Act 60, expat strategies, income instruments, college funding, retirement planning. You need to keep your books immaculate. Don't trust that your interpretation is going to hold. The IRS revises that guidance. That reinterpretation becomes a new risk threshold. So understand this. Smart money families, they don't guess. They plan. And planning now means knowing the rules, proving your stance, staying agile in a world where yesterday's safe could become today's audit headline. If you want to learn more about how to put it all together correctly, nothing fancy, not to the point where you're going to be under IRS scrutiny. You just want to make sure you've got the right plan. Check out our website, mergentadvisors.net. That's MERGENT, mergentadvisors.net. Or if you've got kids that are approaching college in the next 5 to 10 years, even if you're on the cusp of it, you need to know what you need to know now. They just changed the rules starting in 2026. So if you're doing it the old way, it's going to cost you. Check out mergentcollegeadvisors.com if you want to build that defensive architecture before the next beautiful bill blindsides your harvest.
Nice. Well, thanks for coming on, Doug. And that's the show for this week. If anyone has any questions about any weird and interesting tax strategies, feel free to give us a call. We're always interested in learning new things. We, like I said, just learned a new one this morning, so I'm really excited for that one. But yeah, we're always looking at different strategies. We love this stuff. To me, it's like a kid at Christmas learning this stuff. And even if it doesn't work out, you just learn something new about how the world works. So that's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.